students, I hope you are all having a great day today. My name is Torres, and I want to take a moment to thank you for joining me for a little Psych 101. In this video, we will learn about biology and behavior, specifically how genetics and evolution add to what we know about psychology. This video has three overarching ideas. 1. Our behavior results from the interactions of many factors. 2. Genetics influence behavior, but genetics cannot control behavior in ways that are independent of the environment. And 3. Natural selection processes allow traits that are most beneficial for survival to be inherited by future generations. The topic of this video will focus on the vocabulary on this slide. You can find this information in the Google slide presentation and in the Psych 101 Key Vocab Google Doc. Both of these files are linked in the description box below. What does it mean when we say that everything psychological is simultaneously biological? Well, it means that everything that happens in our mind is a result of a biological event, a series of nerve impulses, and the instructions for these nerve impulses come from our genetic makeup. Humans are biological creatures living in social spaces. To understand human psychology, it is important to study how biological, psychological, and social systems interact. The branch of psychology that researches the interactions of biology, behavior, and mental processes is biopsychology. The branch of biopsychology that researches how evolution has influenced psychology is evolutionary biology. Evolutionary psychology assumes two elementary principles of genetic evolution and developmental biology. First, the genes that define contemporary human populations are products of a long history of evolution driven by natural selection. Second, the human nervous system typically develops according to a recipe encoded in those genes. And by systematically considering the implications of those assumptions, this approach yields new insights about how the human's mind was designed by natural selection and about how our minds work right here and right now. Genetics is a scientific study of genes and heredity. When we study genetics, we look at how certain qualities or traits are passed from parents to offspring. Evolution is related to psychology because evolution favors genetic variations that produce adaptive behavior. So how do genes work? All humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, meaning they have 46 chromosomes total. Except for sex cells, meaning sperm and egg cells, every single cell in the entire body carries a complete set of biological instructions for building that organism, and that is housed inside the nucleus of the cell. In this illustration, you can see a round purplish circle. That circle is the nucleus of the cell. The chromosomes are inside that nucleus, and you can see them all kind of scattered around. The publisher decided to make them the same color. When they're lined up, you can see that chromosome 1 pair are both yellow. Chromosome 1 has two chromosomes. There's one on the left and one on the right. Chromosome 2 pair are both that hot pink color. Chromosome 3 pair is a light blue color. The 23rd chromosome pair is what ultimately determines the biological gender of a person. Each one of the chromosomes in the pair consists of a long, tightly coiled chain of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. This molecule holds a person's unique genetic characteristics. By the way, did you know that each strand of DNA in each cell is 6 feet long? In this illustration, you can see that segment lengths of DNA are genes. There's a segment that might code for height. Another segment might code for eye color. Alleles are alternate versions of the same genes. So for example, you might have a segment of the DNA that will code for eye color, but siblings might have two different types of codes within that gene. One sibling might have blue eyes and another sibling might have brown eyes. They have different alleles. This explains why siblings may look similar but are not identical. Siblings will have unique DNA to them. However, identical twins do have identical DNA. Remember when I said that sex cells did not have 46 total chromosomes? Human sex cells, like sperm and egg cells, have 23 chromosomes total. That's because when the sex cells join to make a baby, the baby has to receive half of the chromosomes from the mother and half of the chromosomes from the father to get the whole set of 46. So 23 from mom, 23 from dad, to get a total of 46. The combination of receiving different alleles from mom and different alleles from dad results in increased variation from generation to generation. Now remember, I said that identical twins have identical DNA. In their case, a fertilized egg splits. So a fertilized egg that already has 46 chromosomes total divides and resumes growing as two separate embryos. So that's why both of those embryos, the embryos of identical twins, end up having identical DNA. With the different combinations of alleles, we get more variations in the gene pool. However, sometimes variations can also result from mutations. A mutation is an alteration in the DNA sequence of a gene. Mutations can be beneficial, they can have no effect at all, or they can be damaging. If the mutation is favorable to survival, it is more likely to continue to be passed along from one generation to the next. Now that we've had an opportunity to talk about the biology associated with genetics, let's tie it back to what we know about psychology. Combining the information about genetics with the first video on major figures and approaches in psychology, you'll remember that Charles Darwin was influential in some of the initial theories about psychology and how the mind works. Charles Darwin proposed the idea of natural selection. His theory was that adaptation to the environment results from natural selection, which then results in evolution. Physical traits that aid in survival and reproduction of offspring are passed on. By reproducing, the species becomes more fit. In this sense, fitness means the ability to reproduce. Since the species with that favorable trait is reproducing faster or in greater numbers than the species with less desirable traits, nature itself will start to select them out of the population, becoming less and less common. Therefore, species with the alleles that are best for survival become greater in number and have more access to resources like food or area to live. This also acts as a force to eventually eliminate alleles that are less likely to aid in survival. As these forces continue to happen, the eventual gradual change leads to evolution of the species. However, what was unknown at the time that Darwin came up with these ideas back in 1859 was the mechanism of how genes hold hereditary information that transfers from parent to offspring. Back in this time, they didn't even know what DNA was. They weren't sure how traits go from parent to offspring. They just realized that they did, and beneficial traits that allowed a species to survive and allowed a species, because of its survival, to continue to reproduce, had their genetic information passed on from generation to generation. Now science has a very good understanding of how genetic information is passed on from one generation to the next, and they also know how variation, either through the joining of sex cells or through mutations, can also lead to better adaptation. Connecting this more directly to psychology, We also learned William James, founder of functionalism, was influenced by Darwinism. His theory was mental activities contributed to basic environmental survival. Functionalism refers to the psychological philosophy that considers mental life and behavior in terms of active adaptation to a person's environment. So by applying James's theory that mental activities contributed to basic environmental survival, and we know that genetics also contributes to basic environmental survival, that there has to be a connection between the two. Proponents of functionalism made a connection that since mental activities contributed to basic environmental survival, and there was a genetic biological basis for that, then constructs like intelligence, memory, psychological well-being had to be biologically based and therefore inherited. Since a trait like intelligence was biologically based, then natural selection could also act upon traits like intelligence, memory, leadership skills, etc. There were two notable figures that were highly influenced by the work of Darwin. One was Darwin's cousin, his name was Francis Galton, and another person was James Cattell. Both of them believed that mental abilities like intelligence were inherited and could actually be measured using mental tests. Like Galton, Cattell believed society was better served by identifying those people with superior intelligence, and he supported efforts to encourage them to reproduce. Such beliefs were associated with eugenics. Eugenics is the promotion of selective breeding with humans. Eugenics is problematic for a variety of reasons. Scientifically, it decreases variation in the gene pool. Socially, inequalities rise because one group will be more favored than another. It imposes arbitrary, random standards of perfection on a huge range of people by a discerning few. And finally, there's a worry that some groups will be forced into behavior that they do not choose, such as forced pregnancy or forced sterilization. The current framework is that there is a genetic component that affects human psychology. However, it's not just genetics that influences human psychology. Genetics can lead to distal explanations on how a human behaves the way they do. A distal explanation is an explanation at the evolutionary level. However, there are also proximal explanations that also explain why a person behaves the way they do. Proximal explanations are explanations that regard the mechanism, the immediate conditions of an animal that brings on the behavior. So, for example, a person may have some hereditary talent. Let's say that the child of a very talented guitar player has some innate talent for that skill. But it's not just their genetics that will make them a great guitar player. It also has to do with any influences that happen to them during the time that they mature and develop into themselves. Things like a support system, access to lessons, role models. All those things are equally, if not more important to the person's ability to become a great guitar player. Let's look at another example. Research suggests that there is an association between genetic factors and depression. For example, if a person has a history of depression in their family, say their grandmother or parents also suffered from depression, they might have a predisposition to depression. Scientists are able to isolate sections of chromosomes that will verify the patient has genetic information that is linked directly to depression. So that's something they're born with, that's something that's in their genes. Next, let's suppose that the attachment style that they experience when they're a child is an ambivalent attachment style. An ambivalent attachment style comes from a childhood in which love and affection are inconsistently given, based on factors that the child does not understand. So love and affection, though the child desperately wants this, are incredibly fragile things that can vanish without warning. Because the child is never sure of receiving love and affection, they have an overriding necessity to secure what they consider to be insecure. That's a closer explanation as to why someone may be depressed. Let's say that later as an adult, they experience a huge rejection. They may be rejected from a career that they desperately want, or from a partner that they wanted to create a relationship with. That is a more proximal explanation as to why the person is depressed. So a distal explanation is the genetics that the person is born with. Something that is distal but is much more proximal is the ambivalent attachment style that they experienced as a child. The most proximal explanation is a rejection by a career choice or by their desired partner. This immediate condition is the most proximal explanation of why that person is depressed. So as you see, this makes a case that it is a combination of genetic factors and environmental factors that will lead to the best explanation for behavior. Finally, when discussing the role of genetics in psychology, there are two fallacies to avoid. Fallacies are mistaken beliefs that are based on an unsound argument. The first fallacy is the naturalistic fallacy. Natural selection is not a moral force. The naturalistic fallacy argues that if something is natural, it must be good. Values such as goodness and truth are held to be human perceptions, and they are independent of any natural force. In other words, just because natural selection is occurring, it does not necessarily mean that it's a good thing. The second fallacy is deterministic fallacy. Deterministic fallacy is a mistaken assertion that genes control or determine behavior in a manner that is independent of environmental influences. Genes cannot control everything. Genetic information is not sufficient to fully explain behavior. All factors, especially those coming from the environment, must be considered in order to fully understand why a person or animal behaves the way they do. In today's video, we learned our behavior results from the interaction of many factors. Genetics influence behavior, but genetics cannot control behavior in ways that are independent of the environment. Natural selection processes allow traits that are most beneficial for survival to be inherited by future generations. For reflection, please take a few moments to consider the following open-ended question. Can you think of an example where genes influenced behavior traits through interaction with the environment? I'd love to get your thoughts in the comments below. That's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we will discuss the role of the nervous system in psychology. Before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Stats with Torres for more Psych 101. Looking forward to it. Ciao!